knowing that there's open communication makes the most difference. Getting to the point, getting to the truth, and making sure that the decision makers have the ability to move to the next step.
Knowing the quality of the engineering they have in their country, and not saying, yeah, this is not from the US, this is not domestic, to be able to judge and make inspect what they're doing to judge the engineering.
In all, we know from our engineering practice, whether helping contractors out with issues or whatever, I think it's just if you do the approach where you just sort of shy away from it or sort of step away from it. I don't think that's the right attitude, let's say.
All right, here we are for the next installment. And I actually asked Russ, who has been a repeat guest on the podcast, to extend an invitation to those that he admired within the industry. So let me give him the stage here to introduce our guests and maybe give a little bit of context about the collective background here
Sure.
today.
Thank you, Adrian. I'd like to introduce Patrick Ullmer and Yalin Uluaydin from Eckersley O'Callaghan. They are close colleagues of mine in more ways than one. The Eckersley O'Callaghan mark goes back a long way, and I've been involved with James O'Callaghan, Phil Khalil, and their team over the years, and collaborate with them closely now too, in more ways than one, as I said. But Yalin is somebody who has his own pedigree, his own capability, and his own expertise, and I admire him for that. So I thought he would be an excellent person to join. And Patrick is an up-and-comer at EOC who is kicking ass, and so I thought that it would be good to have him join too. That's the introduction.
Welcome, guys. So how about I have a few topics I want to dive into, but I want to kind of get into a little bit of a call it story or case study that I'm actively looking at on a project. And this ties back to some of the things we've discussed, Russ, and I want to get your perspective on it. So working on a project that's building stride in and complete, and we're coming across some glass failure. And so as that could happen in any type of glass makeup, whether it's due to heat stress or nickel sulfide inclusion, Russ and I have sort of dug into the different methodologies or modes of glass failure and how you inspect and assess that type of condition. But let's actually take it in a different direction and look sort of on you could talk about the forensic side of things and the assessment side of things, but there's also, the contracting side of things and how all this is handled in terms of your supply chain and the manufacturer and the glazing contractor and who's liable for what. And it can get a little bit messy. So I'm working on a project with a very complex glass makeup. It's a double laminated glass configuration. And it seems that the light is beginning to delaminate, and the actual cause of failure has yet to be determined. The delamination, it appears, is occurring on the inboard light. And we don't know if it's due to some type of thermal shock or induced stress. But ultimately, it's tough because who's the glass expert at the end of the day? You can have a glazing contractor who should be able to speak to the product that it is that they're selling, but ultimately you have to go back to the fabricator and then back to the float glass supplier to identify the issue. So long story short, maybe you could start talking a little bit, Russ, in terms of, don't have to name project specific or location, but if you've been in that situation where you've either been hired by a glazing contractor or directly by an owner to sort of assess that type of condition. And then what happens next? You submitted a report and sort of assess the condition, but what does that typically turn into? Like, how, in an ideal world, how does that process streamline flow?
I know that Yalin will have some input to this sort of situation too. From my point of view, depending on what the problem is, it's first of all beneficial to be working for a party that you can talk truth to. That's absolutely the case. And I know in my experience, having worked for owners in the past, it's been very useful to give them the raw information and then to have them filter out the parties involved, the sort of responsibility path, and then to decide how to deal with it. We've dealt with delamination projects before, and we've dealt with nickel sulfide projects before, where understanding the problem is obviously key to figuring out the remediation. And so that's a general response that's very useful to know. Depending on the situation, sometimes the context is such that the information is filtered before it gets to the real decision makers. And I think that can be basically a delay, and that's a problem. So that's the first thing I would say. I'm wondering if, Yalin, you have experience with this sort of thing too, and knowing that EOC speaks so directly to fabricators and has such a good line into the top fabricators, I'm sure that there's some input there.
Oh yeah, we do have quite a bit of work that has come through on either failures or issues that have come up with glass. And I think one thing that doesn't happen is sort of what the expectations are for some of these, mainly regarding warranty. The fabricators and the suppliers usually will exclude, let's say, glass breakage for the most part. I mean, glass is brittle, it breaks, right? So how can you put that in a warranty? But there are things you can warrant, or let's say are sort of under some qualitative or quantitative criteria warrants, like the nickel sulfide or whether it's thermal stress. Some of them are less common, but I think the issue has been really what happens after you determine the cause or the issue. Most of the time, the glass supplier will say, well, I'll give you the glass. And then who installs it, who covers that cost. A lot of that is just sort of not written in the warranties and usually won't be covered because why would you? I think the other aspect, like you're saying, who's responsible, I think, if obviously there's some things that are pretty obvious, someone drops a hammer on a piece of glass, yeah, that's usually it goes, I mean, it's a long process, a chain of people you have to go through. Well, who did it? Is it the roofer? Okay, well, the roofer has to kind of go through the CM, and then your glazer has to go through the CM, and usually it's the CM or the GC that's sort of in the middle to control these things. So it gets complicated. But in terms of what we do, we would put together a report or determine some sort of a cause, and then it's most of the time I've seen it just sort of go away and it's dealt behind closed doors. But rarely I think goes to, let's say, what none of us want to see is like the courts. It's usually, and we're all living in an industry where we want to build relationships and keep good relationships. So I think there's a little bit of, give and take there. If you have, for example, some attic stock or something going into, dipping into that is sometimes what people do. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one, and we're usually rarely involved in sort of what happens after, for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
I think there is a lot of testing and validation that's done on site to test what people perceive as complete assemblies, whether it's a mega panel, unitized curtain wall, window wall, or rain screen type system. But actually testing, if you were to break down the original the initial components, it's like you want to test the glazed assembly. So you want to see how the glass is affixed to or sealed against the framing member. But how about like the due diligence that's actually done on the IGU itself?
Right.
It sort of seems like it's an area that's like kind of very siloed within the industry, and a lot of people don't know about it. And these highly, highly complex jobs where there's all kinds of scrutiny and a big VMU just on the glass alone, like on an Apple store, fine, they're going to do their due diligence because there's 20 lights and they have to perfect it. But on a job with 500 units of window wall or windows, it's like it doesn't seem like that diligence is actually done at the IGU fabricator level.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways to validate that. You can't test for every job, obviously, in some cases. And some of the more specialty work that we worked on, I think it comes down to one, qualifying a fabricator or a supplier. You can have a list of folks you use or sort of pre-qualified, let's say. And then the other part is you need to sort of do your diligence on who has a, let's say, the IGMAs, IGCCs, does it have European CE approval, which is sort of, it's not equal, let's say, but it's similar to the US IGCC. And I mean, the idea of that is that you've got this product that you can, has tested through, the ASTM standards and is sort of pre-approved with a specific set of components. So, I don't know if you're familiar with the IGCC process. To test for the ASTM, what is the E2190? I mean, that's like a 3 or 4 month long test. They put the IGUs through hell, and it takes a long time in the chamber to keep that IGU and constantly, do the cycles. Now, if you want to spend, 4 or 5 months of your project schedule on that, that's tough. I mean, 6 months out of a project, that's a long time to have an unknown in your job of, is your IGU going to fail or pass and all that stuff. So I think one is, I think the front end, the architects and, specifiers need to do their sort of diligence in picking a product or, something that's, and specifying that. So, we do EOC, at EOC, we come across jobs where we're part of the architect team. We also work for, and, the contractors and the subcontractors, and the glazers is their primary engineer for the, glazing and curtain wall. And, you do see jobs where they come through, the glazing, like you said, hasn't been scrutinized. So you get a fabricator that's not even IGCC or doesn't even have sometimes European approval. So, you could accept a job where, maybe they have a European approval, because that's pretty, significant, and is pretty, is quite onerous testing. But if it doesn't have any of them, then what do? You've got an IGU that's sort of uncertified. And I think it starts with the architect and, specifying team. And then I think the contractors obviously have to follow through with that. Picking a product that has the spacer that's certified, the gas filling, and all this stuff that has to go through. Otherwise, like you said, you could test it for the job, but I think it's just, I've never seen it happen just because it's just such a lengthy process. Yeah.
So what is, Patrick, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on, because you have a little bit less experience, so do I, than Russ does. So his perspective might be a little bit different. But from your experience or your career thus far in the industry, how do you view quality overall? Has it underwhelmed you, overwhelmed you? Or is it sort of on par with what you expected it to be? How do you just think the quality of sort of the materiality assembles and trades have been from what you've witnessed to date?
That's actually an interesting one, because previously I've been working in Europe, Amsterdam actually, so in the Netherlands, and I was not sure what I was expecting from the American market. In the first place, I thought there would be lower restrictions or lower, let's say, test requirements, but I was surprised when Yalin introduced me into the American market here, and how materials and especially glazing is actually tested. And in some ways, the code restrictions are much more stringent than in Europe, which is interesting, looking at so many glass fabricators, and especially the special glass fabricators being sort of in the European market, and not necessarily here in the US, how that comes together. So I was actually surprised coming here to the US, seeing how inspections are made.
Surprised in a good way.
Yeah.
Now let me ask you, Russ, how have things evolved? I think our standards are higher, our expectations are higher, possibly the consideration, as we discuss a lot on this podcast, incorporating facade specialists and having facade savvy folks on these projects is becoming more and more commonplace. But maybe you operated in a time where there was maybe less eyeballs or scrutiny on the process throughout. Do you think sort of the codes and level of scrutiny has resulted in higher quality, or are other factors sort of trumping or overriding that? And just as a talking point, maybe something like, the lack of skilled labor, or other factors today that might be at the detriment of quality?
I've seen a wide range, and one of the things that's coming across more often than perhaps previously is we've seen systems that have been fabricated by outlying subcontractors to vendors. And I don't want to name names or countries, but it's very, very interesting to see a product that has been purchased outside the United States that was fabricated in a completely remote location from the purchase location. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with there being an impropriety in that, but we've found in investigations we've done recently something that was missing in the production that may be explained by the fact that the way to make a product from another country economical is to actually subdivide the product from the labor, from the QA, QC, and that can become a problem. I think in days of old, so to speak, glass coming from the major fabricators and manufacturers in the United States had a certain quality that everybody relied on. And I think the diversification in terms of having systems come from different places may in fact be part of the explanation as to why things are a little different now. And that brings up something important, what you were mentioning before, and you're talking about the potential that either the size of the project or the quantity of the product determines the quality control. And that's something that really is not it's really not a linear thing. I don't think that it's something that it comes about that because you're buying 1,000 units, you don't need to check 10% of those units. And if 10% of those units have failures, that you don't need to check 80% of those units before they leave the factory. Maybe in the case of large quantity projects, the assumption is that the QA QC does not necessarily involve people from the purchasing side doing their own due diligence because there's some implied aspect of buying like a large quantity of a product that wouldn't be necessary. But I think if you look at bespoke projects where there are testing regimes to test out the validity of a new design or a new concept, where there's a really thorough due diligence exercise, if you look at it from the other extreme, it can't be the case that there's no quality assurance and no quality checking, So I would suggest that regardless of the project size and regardless of where it's coming from, it's important for owners and buyers to know that the sort of train of responsibility is carried all the way to the technician. And by saying that, I'm not trying to get a free dinner in a foreign country. I'm trying to say that if it's only for that purpose to show that the technician understands that out of the 400 pages of the assembly manual, that he or she only needs to look at 5 of those pages, not none of those pages, we'd be in a much better place.
Well, I mean, I think it depends also. Some culturally, there's one cultural differences. I think Europe versus America. I think that's one thing that Patrick touched on. Like, how, for example, just very simply, the Europeans do unitized curtain wall, or, I mean, one, they don't have as much of it, I think, because, there's not a lot of, the tower concept and taller buildings is an American thing. But, the chicken head concept doesn't exist in most European systems, like, some of the European ones. So that's something that when they, for example, let's say they come over here, they're like, okay, that's a different, approach. Reducing field labor versus the gasket, the chicken head gasket that, for example, some of the German or European profiles have. So yeah, I mean, there's that aspect to it and how they bring that over. Sometimes it's reverse technology, I think, transferred back to Europe. That's, for example, I think the performance is improved. And like Russell said, I think part of that quality is a lot of the jobs, they do a PMU and then that's it. I think there needs to be, especially say Windows, right? You do a window PMU and you say it's great, it works, whatever. I think it needs to be a follow-up to that you do a production testing. And some manufacturers have that in-house. It's possibly you do too. They test every 1 out of 50 or 100, whatever the number is you want. So, and that just keeps the production checks in play so that you're not supplying something that's going to be inferior later, and you find out later, which is the worst thing, right? So
I'm going to use a kind of an analogy from different industry and then carry it over to here. So I think I went into a TJ Maxx recently, and there was I don't know, I needed last minute. I was traveling or something, and I needed some type of athletic wear apparel, and I went in, and it was like a New Balance outfit, and it was just incredibly comfortable. It fit well, and it was $12.99, which is I just couldn't believe how cheap it was, and so I'm thinking, what's wrong here? But it's one of my favorite outfits. And so what people, especially in the apparel industry, how they view quality. Some people associate it with price. They just assume it must be good quality because it's expensive. They assume a brand name, a certain brand name is higher quality. So to carry that over into our industry, you don't really have as much of that sort of brand image with contractors and vendors and suppliers, maybe a little bit of it, but like, especially because we're kind of speaking to a lot of, or not a lot of, three representatives here from the design community. When looking at vendors and contractors and suppliers, how do you view quality? I mean, is it equally the actual end product versus the service that's provided, or the responsiveness, or sort of the level of engineering? How do you look at different sort of vendors, contractors, options out there and rank them in terms of higher versus lower quality?
I guess I'll start. I'll say communication is key. Uh, Setting expectations early and then confirming, verifying. That makes for a relationship of trust. And with brand new people to the market, that is what creates the survivor or creates a casualty. And I think all of us on this call have seen survivors and casualties based on the communication. Also, any relationship is worthwhile when it's tested by conflict, and the resolution ends up in a better relationship. And so we've seen where projects have the economics of failure produce a real test as to whether there is a simpler solution or a more difficult solution. And I don't know if I'm digressing, but for me, knowing that there's open communication makes the most difference. Getting to the point, getting to the truth, and making sure that the decision makers have the ability to move to the next step.
I guess what I'll ask is, in our first projects we've ever worked on in the industry, you go in expecting perfection, and then something goes wrong and you think it's the end of the world. And then you get project after project under your belt, and sort of the understanding is that you're going to inherently run into quality issues. You're dealing with human beings, you're dealing with an incredible amount of repetition. And so, Russ, is kind of what you're speaking to. It's not necessarily going in expecting that the quality is going to be perfect, but mitigating some of that upfront, and then just the level of responsiveness and engagement and service that follows within.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you do have issues and how you approach that, of just sort of throwing your hands up and saying, nothing we can do, or, do you fix it, right? So, or find some sort of intermediate solution that everybody's going to at least be happy with. So I think that's very important. That's how I think, like Russell said, you build good relationships like that. I think in all, we know from our engineering practice, whether, helping contractors out with issues or whatever, I think it's just, if you do the approach where, you just sort of shy away from it, or sort of, step away from it, I don't think that's the right attitude, let's say. And I think that goes for most of the trades here. How they approach it is quite important, and I think most of them are more built about building relationships, and I think they find a way to make it happen.
Well, so when it comes to the communication aspect, the reality is we have more unitized systems coming from overseas than not, and there are a few contractors here, when I say domestically, here in the United States, that do some incredible work, and I frankly can't believe how tapped in they are to a global network of either fabrication, engineering, professional level resources, and find a way to connect all of that globally and still deliver a product at a high quality. And so when you speak about communication, I mean, I don't know, Patrick or Yalin, if you could speak to experience working with one of these larger, contractors that is able to bring all of this together and still manage all of the language barriers, and maybe having to ship over replacement units and glass being fabricated from here and getting deliveries and dealing with this and that.
I think it's nice, especially when you have background from overseas, to be able to connect with those people. Let's say the Italians or the people from the UK. You sort of know from your past, especially my studies, I've had to do with every nationality. So for me, it's pretty nice to connect back with those people and know where they come from, know the economical state of their country, what kind of fees can you expect from them, but also knowing the quality of the engineering they have in their country, and not saying, this is not from the US, this is not domestic, to be able to judge and make inspect what they're doing to judge the engineering.
I mean, I think one thing I've seen is that some of the specialty work, especially steel and glass type, custom, let's say, systems, I think a lot of the U.S. Trades are getting more involved in, and I'm really happy about that, being able to work with the U.S. guys, domestic, installers. I think they've just gained more experience and sort of found the supply chains, because I think they weren't necessarily hidden. It's just I don't think they went out to them or reached out to them before. And some of the bigger players I think are using them, and actually using some of the same suppliers or fabricators that any other European, let's say German installer would do. So and I think that's taken the, I guess, industry, I think, quite far personally. I think things have become more competitive that way. So I think it's just a good thing, the way it's developed that way.
Russ, I'm curious because a lot of times, or not a lot of times, when we do podcast episodes, I sense that you're recalling recent events or projects that you've recently worked on. Do you think because of the size of your firm, it allows you to sort of have that level of engagement with your projects? Like what allows you to continue to learn and, I was going to say, not, become the seasoned guy that says, I know it all and I'm going to have a team, working on all these projects. Sort of, I'm assuming you're going to say there's always something new to learn, but is that just a mentality you've taken? And with that, do you think you've continued to grow as a professional, learn at the same accelerated rate throughout your career?
First, I should say that where I come from makes a big difference in where I'm at now. And that is that I started out working in investigations, and I had aspirations to design. And so my career path went from looking at failures to working in an architecture studio to working with a high-end design firm and eventually becoming somebody who knows about both. And I think what ends up being most critical is being able to provide the decision makers the information for them to make the choices they need to make, and as soon as possible. There's nothing Hollywood about this. It's about understanding what one knows, what one doesn't know, and making that abundantly clear. Perhaps, opining on the risks of one decision versus another. I can think, you're exactly right. I'm thinking of recent experience. There was a project that Avro worked on where there were 30 floors of delaminating handrail, glass handrail. And Avro was working on behalf of the owner. And one of the owner's real concerns was that they hadn't occupied the building yet, and they could not occupy the building with delaminated handrails. And so that became one of the major aspects of getting the information to all the parties so that the resolution could come about. And it also bound all the parties into an understanding of what would satisfy the owner and avoid more onerous outcomes. And so I think that as an investigation part of a project, it's really important to make things plain, to make things explainable, and to make things available for the decision makers to move on. And then from a design point of view, it's almost the same thing, with certainly a different sense as to what is possible, and also a manner of approach that allows people to think freely, and at the same time to be within the guardrails of quality standards, which is what we've been talking about so far.
I didn't think on a technical engineering related podcast we'd be talking so much about communication, but it's just funny that I was a mechanical engineering background, and I had a roommate that was civil engineering, and we kind of laughed at him and said the curriculum was a joke because he had to take a communications class. But the reality is with engineering, it's just like you described. I mean, I still work on projects day to day, and even just getting everybody in a room and to agree on what the mode of failure is and who's responsible and how we're going to come up with a resolution to not greatly impact the schedule and have all these rippling impacts. Like you and everybody on this call, dealing with such complicated topics, how to make that easily digestible for the owner that might have no technical experience, and be able to speak in a unique way to each project stakeholder or entity so that they understand the issue at hand and they don't look at you like the enemy. I would think that's what really makes an effective sort of technical professional to be able to speak throughout to all stakeholders. But I think everybody on this conversation, we've probably learned the hard way and realized, I've come in the past just with the big grenade and said, you forgot this, stop the schedule, stop this as the facade inspector. But that's not the effective way. But I feel like you have to go through that to learn that and to come out and realize that ultimately you want to be heard. Like, you're not just submitting a report or writing an email just to raise red flags and be provocateur. You're trying to get the building complete, maintain your reputation, and ultimately relay your impact in a positive way. And I think that's part of it. I think everybody wants to feel heard and have their sort of stake in the project be felt by all others. But there's an effective way to do that, and I think I continue to try to find a way to learn to be better at that. And I would think everybody can in some sense.
I think not being an alarmist is, especially if you bring issues up, and like you said, you drop the grenade and you say, well, everyone looks at you like, okay, so what do we do then? That's the other issue, is like, you could do that, just blow the whole thing apart. But then if you don't have a solution for it, that's obviously just not going to do anything, or, it's not productive. Doesn't help anyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy, and I'm guilty of this, to be the inspector and to just write up a report and said, this was wrong on your detail, you didn't do this, you didn't place the embed properly, you didn't anchor where you could, but okay, that's fine. Then they get the report, and the GC or CM is going to say, goddamn sub, go fix this. But then it's their problem in their hands, and they have to resolve it. So it's sort of, and I think everybody on this call has probably played that role, and then, because I know, Russ, specifically, you've worked with fabricators, then helping them design the fix. That's where the real magic is. And that's ultimately where the real value is created.
I've come to understand through training staff and dealing with decision makers that ultimately many of the technical decisions are technically oriented, of course, but they actually have an ethical aspect. And I don't want to necessarily, digress to philosophy or anything like that if it's not necessary, but very often it's understanding the context in which a technical truth is best dealt with in terms of the parties involved. And that doesn't mean to mollycoddle anybody. It means to make sure that the decision makers have the information to make the next step. And it's an ethical problem as well as a technical problem. And experienced engineers, I think, come to understand how to conduct themselves. Experienced people in our industry understand how to conduct themselves to have a larger picture, almost 1,000-foot view, I suppose, and to make sure that something that could really keep you awake at night is dealt with in the proper way.
Absolutely. All right, guys, I really appreciate you coming on. This was a fun conversation, and hope we can come on for round two.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Adrian.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate that.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Take care.
Bye.